Every global power has a low point. China's was the worst, and its recovery reshaped the modern world. Today, China is one of the most powerful nations on Earth. But just over a century ago, it was being carved up like a birthday cake by foreign powers. The country that gave the world paper, gunpowder, and the compass was forced to its knees, humiliated, invaded, and stripped of its dignity. What happened? How did China go from being the sick man of Asia to a superpower that makes the West nervous? This is the story of China's darkest chapter, and the comeback that changed everything. In the early 1800s, China saw itself as the center of the world. And honestly, it kind of was. The last Chinese dynasty, the Qing, ruled over the largest, richest, most populated empire on the planet. Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain were status symbols across Europe. The emperor lived in the Forbidden City, surrounded by luxury that made European palaces look basic. But China was confident. Too confident, if I may say. While Europe was going through the Industrial Revolution, building factories, railways, and modern armies, China stuck to the old ways. The Qing court believed they had nothing to learn from the outside world. Foreigners were seen as barbarians who should feel honored just to trade with China. This attitude would cost them everything. This period, Britain had a problem. They were obsessed with Chinese tea. I'm talking millions of pounds of tea shipped to Britain every year. But China didn't want anything Britain had to offer. They wanted silver, hard cash. This created a massive trade imbalance that was draining Britain's economy. So Britain came up with a solution, a twisted, evil solution. They started smuggling opium into China. Opium was grown in British-controlled India, shipped to China, and sold illegally by British merchants. At first, it was just the rich getting hooked. But soon, opium dens were everywhere. Millions of Chinese people became addicts. Farmers stopped working the fields. Soldiers became too weak to fight. Silver started flowing out of China and into British pockets. The entire Chinese economy was collapsing from the inside. The Qing government knew what was happening. In 1839, Emperor Daoguang sent a guy named Lin Zexu to the port city of Canton to stop the drug trade. Lin was tough. He didn't mess around. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, basically saying, "How would you like it if we poisoned your people?" But no reply. He confiscated over 1,000 tons of opium from British merchants and destroyed it all. He dumped it into the ocean. Britain's response? War. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842, and it was brutal. China had more soldiers, but Britain had steamships, modern cannons, and rifles that could reload fast. Chinese troops were still using swords, spears, and outdated matchlock guns. It wasn't even close. British warships sailed up Chinese rivers, bombarding coastal cities. Chinese generals tried traditional tactics that had worked for centuries, but they were useless against industrial warfare. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. China lost, badly. In 1842, they were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking. This treaty was a disaster. China had to pay Britain 21 million ounce silver in compensation. They had to open 5 ports to British trade. Worst of all, they had to hand over Hong Kong to Britain. Forever! Just when you think things couldn't get worse, they did. In 1856, the Second Opium War broke out. This time, Britain had help from France. The excuse? A Chinese patrol boat stopped a ship that might have been flying a British flag. That's all it took. This war was even more brutal. British and French forces marched inland. In 1860, they reached Beijing and did something unthinkable. They burned down the old Summer Palace, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world at the time. It was filled with priceless art, books, and treasures collected over centuries. They looted it, then set it on fire. The palace burned for 3 days. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Tientsin, opening even more ports, allowing foreign diplomats in Beijing, legalizing the opium trade, and paying even more money. Christian missionaries were given the right to spread their religion anywhere in China. Stephen Platt, in his book Imperial Twilight, describes this period as the moment when China's self-image as the center of civilization was shattered. The Qing dynasty wasn't just defeated militarily, it was humiliated spiritually. Once Britain broke China open, everyone wanted a peace. France took control of Vietnam, which had been a Chinese tributary state. Russia grabbed massive chunks of land in the north. Germany claimed territory in Shandong. Japan, recently modernized itself, looked at China and saw weakness. China wasn't colonized like Africa or India. Instead, it was carved up into spheres of influence. Foreign powers controlled China's ports, railways, and mines. They ran their own courts and didn't have to follow Chinese law. Chinese people in their own country were second-class citizens. Signs in some areas literally said, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." The Qing government tried to modernize. They started the self-strengthening movement in the 1860s, trying to adopt Western technology while keeping Chinese values. They built shipyards, bought modern weapons, and sent students abroad to learn. But it was too little, too late. The corruption ran too deep. The court was divided between reformers and conservatives. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who held real power, cared more about keeping her position than saving the country. By 1900, the Chinese people had had enough. A group called the Boxers, officially known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, rose up. They believed they had magical powers that made them immune to bullets. They attacked foreigners, Chinese Christians, and anyone associated with Western influence. The Qing government, desperate and confused, decided to support them. That was a big mistake. 8 foreign nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, formed an alliance and invaded China. They crushed the Boxers, occupied Beijing again, and forced China to pay 450 million tiles of silver in reparations. That's more money than the entire Chinese government's annual revenue. Odd Arne Westad, in Restless Empire, points out that this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological breaking point. The Chinese people realized their government couldn't protect them. The legitimacy of the Qing dynasty was destroyed. In 1911, the Qing dynasty finally collapsed. A revolution led by Sun Yat-sen and others overthrew the emperor. China became a republic, but it wasn't the happy ending anyone hoped for. The country fell apart. Warlords carved up different regions and fought each other for control. The central government barely existed. Peasants starved while generals lived like kings. China, once the most advanced civilization on Earth, had become a failed state. And then things got even worse. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. In 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion of China. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in human history. The rape of Nanking in 1937 saw Japanese soldiers massacre between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians, and prisoners of war in just 6 weeks. Women were raped. Children were killed. The city was destroyed. Japanese soldiers used Chinese prisoners for bayonet practice and held competitions to see who could behead the most people. For 8 years, China fought Japan. The Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong temporarily stopped their civil war to fight the invaders. Millions of Chinese people died. Cities were bombed. Villages were burned. The Japanese used chemical weapons and conducted horrific medical experiments on Chinese prisoners. But something else was happening during this nightmare. The Chinese people, broken and divided for so long, started to unite. A shared hatred of the invaders began to forge a renewed Chinese identity. The humiliation, the anger, the desire for revenge, it all built up like pressure in a volcano. When World War II ended in 1945, Japan was defeated. But China's problems weren't over. The civil war between the nationalists and communists started up again. By 1949, Mao Zedong and the Communist Party won. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan with what was left of his army. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. His words were simple but powerful. The Chinese people have stood up. After a century of being pushed around, invaded, carved up and humiliated, China was finally united under a strong government again. It didn't matter that the country was poor, destroyed, and exhausted. What mattered was that China was China's again. The Communist Party didn't let anyone forget what happened. They turned the century of humiliation into a core part of Chinese identity. It's taught in every school. Museums dedicated to it exist in almost every major city. The message is clear: this must never happen again. This isn't just history, it's a tool. The Communist Party uses the memory of humiliation to justify its rule. They position themselves as the ones who saved China, who made it strong again, who restored its dignity. Any criticism of the party can be framed as weakness that might lead back to the dark days. This narrative drives everything China does today. The massive military buildup? That's so foreign powers can never invade again. The economic development? So China can never be poor and weak again. The aggressive stance on Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. That's about reclaiming what was lost and making sure China is never pushed around again. Under Mao, China tried radical policies like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. These were disasters that killed millions. After Mao died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping took over and changed everything. Deng opened China to foreign investment and market economics while keeping Communist Party control. It was called socialism with Chinese characteristics. What it really meant was, let's get rich. It worked. Over the next 40 years, China experienced the fastest economic growth in human history. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen went from backwaters to futuristic metropolises. China became the world's factory, producing everything from iPhones to furniture. By 2010, China had become the world's second largest economy. Today, it rivals the United States in economic power and surpasses it in manufacturing, trade, and infrastructure development. Modern China is obsessed with proving it's back. They host the Olympics. They build the tallest buildings. They send missions to space and land rovers on Mars. They create massive infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, which invests in countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Chinese leaders constantly reference the century of humiliation in speeches. Xi Jinping, the current leader, talks about the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. The message is clear. China was great, China was humiliated, and now China is great again. This pride isn't just government propaganda. Regular Chinese people feel it too. There's a real sense that China is reclaiming its place as a major civilization. When Western countries criticize China on human rights or trade practices, many Chinese people see it as another attempt to keep China down, just like the Opium Wars. If you want to understand why China acts the way it does, you have to understand the century of humiliation. It's not an excuse, but it is an explanation. When China refuses to back down on Taiwan, it's because losing Taiwan would feel like another piece being carved off by foreign powers. When China builds military bases in the South China Sea, it's about controlling its own waters so foreign navies can't dominate them like Britain did. When China pushes back against Western criticism, it's because they see it as the same arrogance that led to the Opium Wars. The fear of being weak and vulnerable again drives a lot of Chinese policy. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests on the promise that they'll never let China be humiliated again. If they appear weak, their entire justification for power crumbles. This history poisons relationships between China and other countries, especially Japan and Britain. In Japan, there are still fights over how history textbooks describe the invasion of China. Some Japanese politicians visit shrines honoring war criminals, which drives Chinese people crazy. In Britain, there's very little awareness of the Opium Wars and what they did to China. These aren't old grudges. They're active wounds. Chinese people grow up learning about the humiliation in detail. British people barely know it happened. That gap in historical memory creates huge misunderstandings. The truth is, China was genuinely wronged. The Opium Wars were evil. Britain literally poisoned millions of people to fix a trade deficit. The invasion by Japan was horrific. The carving up of China was unjust. But the China of today isn't the victim of 1840. It's a powerful country with nuclear weapons, the world's largest army, and an economy that shapes global markets. The question is whether a country can move forward while constantly looking backward. China is back. That's undeniable. But what kind of power will it be? Some argue that China just wants respect and security, that once it feels safe, it will be a responsible member of the international community. Others worry that a country shaped by humiliation will seek revenge, that the anger built up over a century will eventually explode. What's certain is this: you cannot understand modern China without understanding what happened between 1839 and 1949. The dragon was wounded. The dragon recovered. And the dragon remembers. If this story fascinated you, then you will enjoy the video on your screen right now. Click on it and see you there. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe to keep watching